Look at these two papers. This one is about predicting protein structures using neural networks. It was authored by David Baker's team, winner of the 2024 Nobel Prize in Chemistry for, you guessed it, predicting protein structures. The second paper is written by John Jumper in 2021. John Jumper also won the Nobel Prize in Chemistry in 2024 along with David Baker. Baker's paper is the highest cited paper with 4,391 citations, an average of 1,463 citations per year, making up 2.41% of his citations. Meanwhile, Jumper's paper has 31,235 citations, a 10,411 yearly average, constituting nearly 56.6% of all Jumper's citations. What is weirder is that nearly 37% of Baker's work has no citations at all. For John Jumper, it is 41%. We will get back to this weird observation later. Then, protein measurement with the Follin phenol reagent is the most cited paper in history with 305,148 citations, averaging 4,180 citations per year. Oliver Lowry wrote it in 1951. It dwarfs the citation counts of any paper you pick. This is why Lowry never won the Nobel Prize. We said all these to arrive to our main question of this episode. How should we value a scientist's work? Previously, we talked about the growth of science and distribution of productivity among scientists. These distributions defy equity, and they disobey normal and Poisson distributions, but follow the Pareto distribution. We define eminent scientists as those top producers who publish 50% of the papers, but simply counting papers is pointless. We must consider the value of each paper by measuring its quantum of useful knowledge. This quantum of knowledge is used by others. This is measured through citations. Some papers contain so many quanta of new knowledge and understanding that make their authors many times more valued than the most prolific ones, and perhaps win them the Nobel Prize, while others will be ignored entirely. We will still mainly focus on Derek D. Sola Price's Little Science, Big Science and investigate other sources as needed. Now, as scientists, we all know that our motivation to publish is not just to increase our publication count or communication of knowledge. There are incentives caused by forces of social institutions of science and psychology of scientists. What are these forces? In 1613, Barnaby Rich wrote, "One of the diseases of this age is the multiplicity of books. They doth so overcharge the world that it is not able to digest the abundance of idle matter that is every day hashed and brought forth into the world." Back then, scientists published books to report their results. They were numerous and expensive, and it was impossible to read all of them in a reasonable amount of time. In 1665, the Philosophical Transactions of Royal Society was established, aiming to summarize them to make it easier for scientists to find out about each other's works. This was the beginning of scientific publication, intended to report contemporary developments. But there was a resistance to the idea of single-author papers instead of a book. For example, Newton faced a lot of controversies over his optical papers. He'd rather publish them in a complete and accurate book. Furthermore, authors did not accurately reference other works they used. Fast forward to the 1860s. Most of the authors published single-author papers in letter or monograph format. They concisely discussed their already published works or reported what projects were in progress where. At this time, authors also began to count the references they used as footnotes. Now, since the papers were short and scientists were reluctant to publish in that format, what kept this system of publication going? The answer is priority claims. Back then, many discoveries were made simultaneously and independently by two scientists. There was simultaneous discovery of calculus by Newton and Leibniz, and the dispute between Newton and Hooke over mathematics of elliptic orbits. To claim ownership of a discovery, they announced it through single-author papers. Galton described them as ripe apples that had already fallen. These were like low-hanging fruits, easy projects with low barrier to discovery that could be grasped by many scientists simultaneously. Let's say we have 1,000 ripe apples on the tree of knowledge and 1,000 blindfolded scientists that are trying to pick them. What will be the probability that two scientists simultaneously grab the same apple? How about the probability of 3 or 4 or 5 scientists grasping the same apple simultaneously? Such a process will follow the Poisson distribution. Merton studied the simultaneous discovery frequency. We can see the similarities between 2, 3, and 4 scientists making simultaneous discoveries, but not for higher numbers. For we may have 1,000 eminent scientists at one time, but having 1,000 available discoveries is unrealistic. In addition, the difference in 5 and 6 simultaneous discoveries implies that the number of tempting, easy discoveries may be underestimated in the Poisson model. Merton also showed that 42% of discoveries were shared with no sign of decline in frequency, while the number of disputes for priority claims were decreasing since 1700s. Perhaps scientists found the disputes a waste of time and refrained from them. Then, if the claim is that papers are published to communicate knowledge and reduce the number of multiple discoveries, they are doing a very bad job of it. It seems that scientists who pick a ripe apple simultaneously remained blindfolded to their colleagues' work, so the priority claim remains as the main motive for continuation of scientific publication. Galileo, Hooke, Kepler, Newton, and others sometimes published their frontier works in cryptograms so they could claim them by providing the decryption key. This allowed them to lay claims without letting the competition to get ahead. Now, if publication fails to inform scientists of their repetitive work, and some scientists don't want to communicate their findings to hinder the competition, then why do they still publish? If Beethoven had not created Symphony 9, no one else would. This type of creative work is only possible by its maker. Scientific discoveries, however, are there to be made. If Fermi hadn't discovered the nuclear reactor, someone else would. Scientists publish for the glory of being the first. In the present day, this competitive pressure has led to fraudulent and illicit publication, like the man who tried to fake an element, the man who almost faked his way to the Nobel Prize, and the man who faked human cloning. Furthermore, we should admit we all enjoy the applause at the end of our lectures at conferences. We all share the same serotonergic circuit with lobsters that governs our perception of status. For scientists, the work is extraverted. It is about recognition by fellow scientists. Now, we know that duplicity in scientific discoveries is very common, and scientific papers don't prevent it. But duplication validates the results and allows for improvement, while reproducing the same work from scratch seems a waste. It's easy to blame this on societies, publishers, librarians, and editors. But we will ask, why do papers fail to prevent duplication? Let's say you're one of those eminent pioneers who lived in the 1500s and 1600s, like Galileo. Since there is only one of you, you only have to follow your own work, and maybe Kepler's and a handful of others. But when exponential growth increases the number of scientists to a few hundred, keeping track of all becomes nearly impossible. In our era, it is unfathomable to follow all scientists in your field, as their number is in tens of thousands. Then the question becomes, how many scientists and papers can we practically follow to produce our own work? At most, we can follow about 100 scientists, same as the number of papers we can read per paper we publish. Let's say you are a prolific author who published 100 first or single author papers in a 50-year career. If you needed to read 10,000 papers per publication, you would read 1 million papers, 20,000 per year or 55 per day. If you read that much, when would you have time to write? This is simply not possible. If you read 100 papers per publication, you would be reading about half a paper a day, a manageable number. We can also estimate this upper limit by considering the average number of references per paper. Various sources suggest about 50 references per paper, with an average of 5 authors. Then each author contributes 10 citations. Assuming graciously that this is 10% of what they read, we can arrive at an upper bound of 100 papers per published paper. Price suggests scientists maintain in-depth communication with at most 100 colleagues, forming an inner circle of correspondence. Reading outside of this circle means ignoring some within it. Classically, a journal is founded with a core group of members reading each other's work. Over time, others join, libraries subscribe, and an economic endeavor emerges behind the publication system. In 1963, Price estimated that 10 million cumulative papers were published. Given a doubling time of 15 years, by 2023 this number would reach 160 million. The distribution of productivity among scientists follows Lutgau's square law. If the most prolific scientists publish around 1,500 papers, we estimate about 33.6 million scientists globally. In 2020, the total number of scientific journals was estimated at around 47,000, leading to an average of 715 scientists per journal. In the US, with 6 million scientists and about 40,000 journals, there would be about 150 scientists per journal. When we become a member of a journal like Nature, we potentially follow 150 US-based scientists and 715 worldwide. But we see that we can't follow more than this. If we join 10 journals, we end up following several thousand scientists. But are all journals read and cited equally? No, they are not. Urquhart studied the statistics of 50,000 loan requests submitted to the Central Science Library of London in 1958 for all of 9,120 journal copies available. The reading distribution followed the Pareto distribution. 4,800 journals were not even borrowed that year, and 2,274 journals were only used once. At the other end, the most popular journal had 382 requests. 60 were requested more than 100 times each, and half of the requests were for the top 40 journals. Less than 10% of them were sufficient to meet 80% of the demand. We can observe the same pattern among citations of scientists' paper. For instance, we can see that the distribution of citations of David Baker's work, the Nobel laureate we met at the beginning of this video, is Pareto distribution. Here we can see the distribution of citations of work of 10 authors combined. Now, why is the distribution of citations not uniform? One reason is our social nature. Previously, we saw our social behavior in cities' population and discussed how science tends to crystallize into groups, institutions, fields, and journals. Then using Price's square root law, we can estimate that out of 47,000 journals, half of the reading and citation is done on about 217 of them. But we can still expand on this mechanism of undemocracy in citations of scientific articles. Let's assume that citation record is strongly correlated to an article's or a journal's value. Let's ignore self-citation, citing one's own friends, appeal to authority citations, and assume that they are not for decoration. We must make these assumptions because we can't distinguish them. In 1950, Fussler showed that for chemistry and physics, 50% of citations belong to papers published between 1942 to 1950 and 1945 to 1950 respectively. Gross and Gross studied the 1926 volume of Chemical Abstract and found that the number of references from 15 years ago was half of those from 1 year ago. So generally, older papers are cited less. Based on Fussler's data, while the papers published in 1940 were cited 50% less than those from 1950, the total number of papers available to cite from 1940 was also about half of 1950. This implies that the probability of being cited is constant for papers published each year, which guarantees compound interest leading to exponential growth. But for a good paper, the probability of citation may even increase, and if it is something like cold fusion, then no one would want to touch it. Now, looking at physical review letters, half of the citations were from previous 2.5 years, during which 1/3 of all works in the past decade were published. Because of this short half-life, the number of repeated citations is increased. Then, the more similar the citations of two papers are, the higher the chance that they are duplicate works. This incentivizes scientists to pass the post first, leading to rapid publication, feeding to exponential growth. The time distribution and Pareto-like distribution of citations tell us that most scientific production will be lost in time, and this explains why 40% of Baker's and Jumper's papers are not cited. We cannot really decide how much of this loss is deserved, but a large body of jilted authors will feel that it is not fair, demanding that these distributions become more even by force. Nonetheless, these observations bring us to this question: what are the problems of scientific manpower and productivity? First is the management of eminent scientists so they can communicate in manageable sizes. Their influential works, assuming we can note them, must be collected and compressed into books or reviews. Second is the management of ordinary scientists and lower journals so they can keep up with the elite leaders and publish useful papers. During World War II, scientists in Manhattan Project or Radar Project worked efficiently. Later, they kept meeting by invitation at Rochester Conference for a study of fundamental particles. Such an organization is not perfect. Some top scientists may not show up, and some unqualified scientists may attend. Also, who decides who gets invited? How high should the bar be to permit prodigies? If too many are invited, subgroups will form, leaving many out. These subgroups always emerge in conferences, highlighting the need for a better communication among the top 100 scientists of any field. Taking matters into their own hands, they share reprints, preprints, and pre-preprints, forming a more closed communication circle. Beyond conferences and preprints, top scientists attract institutional invitations for colloquiums and seminars, visiting and working with other elite members for days, weeks, or months before returning to their labs. But their true allegiances lie with the peer group, not the governments or institutions. These are invisible colleges, like those that formed the Royal Society in 1660s. Such communication seems the best way to reduce redundant work. So, the respect elite scientists command allow them to go and meet with other elite scientists and work with them, giving them the prestige they seek. But we have talked so much about how top scientists increase efficiency. What about the average scientists? Ordinary scientists join teams led by eminent scientists. Since the 1950s and before, scientists have crystallized into multidisciplinary groups like Manhattan Projects, with multiple leading minds and a large team of average scientists following them. Between 1900 to 1910, 80% of papers had single authors, 20% had two, and 3% had three. By 1957, only 54% had single authors, while 30% had two, 10% had three, and 6% had more than four. Price predicted single-author papers would be extinct by 1980s. While he was off on timing, the trend was correct. And Martin Jacob and colleagues estimated only 5% of papers to be single-authored in 2020, while in 2000 it was 17%. The larger the author count, the faster the number of such papers grow. Today, 20, 30, and 40 author papers are common. This teamwork results from the drive for productivity. Average scientists increase their output by joining elite research groups, while leaders boost their productivity by hiring junior scientists. In a sense, elite's productivity grows with the number of ordinary scientists. We can view this optimistically. Average scientists naturally join with eminent ones. Rutherford and Liebig, for example, had entourage of researchers and students. But in the era of big science, the leaders are invisible colleges, top-tier collaborators driving science forward. Since 1660s, leaders have published to claim priority and communicate knowledge. For a long time, scientific papers were the main communication medium, but today scientists gain recognition through direct collaboration, not publication. With modern travel and electronic communication, knowledge spreads person to person. Scientists mainly publish for their peers, not for the public. The layman reading a paper or watching its review on YouTube is just a byproduct of scientific growth. This shift changes scientists' motivations, centering them on their work and peers. The art of publishing good papers may be dying, or at least becoming irrelevant. Publications now serve other functions, like supporting scientists' immigration under national interest waivers, or securing grants, or landing academic positions. Even these uses feed into the system's need for growth. Meanwhile, invisible colleges also reinforce their power within science and society. Such growth carries risks, especially in fields and countries lacking strong communication networks. We will discuss this in the next episode. But one example of this invisible colleges wielding power is the domination of fields like string theory and quantum gravity in theoretical physics. We have been pouring the smartest into the most useless field with no tangible results, but more on that later. For now, we must wrap up this video with concluding remarks. So, what are the conclusions? The first is that multiple discoveries are unavoidable because scientists have limited time and attention. They can't follow tens of thousands of papers published daily. At best, they follow a close group of leaders in their field, around 100 or so. The second conclusion is that recently published papers accumulate a higher proportion of citations. Half-life depends on the field and journal, but it is of the order of a few years to a decade. If two papers cite the same works, the chance of them being repetitive is higher, exacerbated by citation half-life. Price sees this as wasteful and believes that rush to publish first should be disincentivized. But this argument does not address how much competition drives the scientist's attitude. The third conclusion is that citations follow a Pareto distribution. Is it fair that 100 papers out of 10,000 get a third of all citations? Those left uncited think not. Notable examples exist, like Mendel, whose work was forgotten until discovered later. This may tempt us to manipulate the system to reduce wasted work or enforce citation equity, but we must think twice before using force to reshape a complex system to match our impulsive delusional wantings. Instead, an uncited scientist should look at the field's leaders and what they are working on. The current system is the closest thing to a free market of ideas. If a topic earns no citations, either no one cares or the scientist is outside the inner circle of that topic. Citations at the first level of analysis reflect market demand, so find those topics, read the highly cited papers, books, and eminent scientists of that field, and identify the profound questions, ones that, if answered, are a small step for you and a giant leap for mankind. Finally, how should we value a scientist's work? There is no objective way to measure quality quantitatively. The best proxy is the citation count, which correlates with quality, just as eminence correlates with publication count. To quote Price, "At this point, most scientists will express disappointment. I suspect they have a secret hope that some standard will be found for the objective judgment of their own caliber and reputation. This craving for recognition unsullied by human subjectivity is in itself an interesting psychological phenomenon, and perhaps we must study lobsters on our channel for a while to understand this need for recognition." Now we have finished learning the laws of scientific growth, laws applicable to many creative and productive fields. In the next episode, we will continue following Price into the social and political future of science.